on to the evolution overview. So talking about how did the first cells evolve, they're fairly simple. Thinking about how complex our multicellular organisms are today, like you and me, early life was very simple. So we had our anaerobic prokaryotic organisms. They didn't live in an oxygen-rich environment because there weren't any organisms performing photosynthesis. Next, we had our photosynthetic organisms, still fairly simple. They're prokaryotic. They didn't have a nucleus. They didn't have any complex membrane-bound cell parts. But they were able to harness energy from the sun and produce that oxygen. In that new oxygen-rich environment, and as our life has evolved, we started getting our eukaryotic organisms, so even more complex. They are having organelles, so that perform certain functions that help them exploit their environment and grow and survive and adapt. And then, of course, we have our multicellular organisms that are also eukaryotic. So that's like you and me. We have organs, we have organ systems, and we live and interact with our environment. So evidence of this. The fossil record is excellent evidence of this. So this tells us what the structures of animals long ago were, and then we can put an approximate time frame of these fossils based on how they were deposited, so the age of the rocks that they're in, the structures that they have or do not have, and can we compare those to living examples today or other ancient examples that we find in fossils. We can look at biochemical similarities, so looking at the DNA sequences, looking at the protein makeup in sequences that organisms have. So how similar on a biochemical level are species? We can also look at shared anatomical structures. So our homologous structures, thinking of the human arm compared to a bat wing or to a bird wing. How do they compare? Knowing that they look similar, they have similar parts, even though their shapes are different, we can surmise that they probably came from a common ancestor because they have those same shared parts. We also have vestigial organs. So this is like our appendix. These are leftover parts from our ancestors that are of no use to us today, but at one point in time, in our ancestral past, we used our appendix to break down tough plant material. We don't eat as much of that tough plant material, so we don't really need it. So our appendix is a vestigial organ. Analogous structures, so structures that serve a similar function but might have a different origin. So this might be a bird wing versus a butterfly. Even though they serve the same function in terms of getting those organisms to fly, they have different original origins. So you would say that even though they're analogous, they do not share a close common ancestor. So in terms of natural selection, what is natural selection? So the environment selects for these certain traits that organisms have. And species can increase exponentially, so these different factors that... So due to natural selection, we can say that our species can increase exponentially. So as you have a lot of individuals in a population, they want to exploit as many resources as they can. So they're going to want to adapt to have as many of those resources available to them that they can, so they can live and they can reproduce and reproduce successfully and pass on their genes. Populations are going to vary due to mutations, whether it's spontaneous mutations that occur naturally that aren't going to be harmful to the organism. This natural variation is going to be what natural selection is selecting for. So if you have an individual in a population that may have a structure that's a little bit better adapted to get that resource, whether it's food or evade a predator or a better way of reproducing, then if that's beneficial, then that individual is going to produce more offspring and their genes are going to persist longer. Now there's finite resources required for life, so it is important that organisms get those resources the best ways that they can. So it's the environment, like I said, that's selecting for these favorable traits. It's going to select a favorable phenotype. So what the creature looks like, the structures that they possess that are going to give them an advantage over others in their population. And these favorable adaptations are going to survive, reproduce, and pass on to offspring. Because if they have that trait, so say in terms of these butterflies, if one of these patterns of butterflies helps them with camouflage or avoiding predators, if they're not getting eaten as often, then they're going to produce more offspring, and there's going to be more butterflies that have that phenotype. And then, of course, you have the accumulation of these changes are going to lead to changes in the species over time. So as those traits are being selected for or selected against, if they're getting eaten or dying or not surviving, then you're going to have an accumulation of these changes, which leads to a different species. So speciation. One of the ways that we get different species is through geographic isolation. So if you have populations of, say we have an ancestral type of salamander here, and they were all the same. And then something happened to the environment. So we have this big valley in California, and it separated these populations, so they're genetically isolated from one another. So the genes can't move throughout the entire population. So that isolation is going to lead to a different frequency of mutations that are occurring naturally, or these alleles within those isolated populations. So the longer that those populations are isolated from one another, the more different that they are going to become. So classification systems. So these continually change based on new information. So that could be new discoveries in the DNA or the structure. A new species might be discovered, a new fossil might be discovered, and then you have to continually update these classification systems. And of course, the classification systems are going to be based on evolutionary relationships between different species. So you can use a dichotomous key, which is kind of a yes-no. Does this animal have this trait? How do you classify it based on the presence of traits or the absence of traits? And be sure that you can interpret a phylogenetic tree like this. So this shows where each of these nodes are, denotes a common ancestor. And then each of the branches here is a specific trait that. So also be sure that you can define the following vocabulary here. So in bioaccumulation, so that's our accumulation of substances like a pesticide in an organism. And as you go up the food chain, it's going to be most harmful to the species at the top of the food chain because you have accumulation of that chemical or that substance through bioaccumulation. A vestigial structure. So my example of the appendix. So that's going to be a structure that has lost its ancestral function. So we don't need our appendix to digest tough foods, roughage, tough plants anymore. So it's vestigial. We still have it. So there's evidence that our ancestors needed it at some point, but we don't use it anymore. It's a vestigial structure. Nitrogen fixation. So this is how nitrogen is going to be entering the living system through the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Natural selection, like I just talked about there. So that is how organisms are adapted to their environment. And organisms adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. So their traits are going to be naturally selected for and will persist through the population. Conservation. So how are we conserving our resources? How are we preserving our habitats? How are we counteracting the negative influences of what we as humans do to the environment? Our derived traits. So that's going to be a trait or something that a current organism has but an ancestor did not. So that derived trait back to that phylogenetic tree would be a new trait that has emerged through natural selection that's going to be beneficial to that organism based on how they adapt to their environment.